To start with, I'd like to go through some of the ideas behind permanent revolution, theory of permanent revolution, which was first developed by the Russian revolutionary Leon Trotsky just over 100 years ago. And the theory first began to take shape in the autumn of 1905, probably, although it was a theory that he worked with throughout his life and continued to develop right into the 1920s and 1930s. It was also a theory which turned out to be substantially backed up by events that unfolded across his lifetime. So, in a sense, the germ of the ideas took place out of his involvement in the Russian Revolution of 1905, which was a dress rehearsal for the revolution of 1917. But the events around the revolution of 1917 then confirmed many of the things that he'd argued. And the defeat of that revolution also negatively underscored the importance of what he'd outlined. The 1905 revolution prompted Trotsky to think in this way, particularly in the last part of the revolution, the peak of the revolutionary wave in the autumn of 1905, when Russia was rocked by an enormous general strike led by workers in St. Petersburg, Moscow, and the big industrial centres of Russia, which really challenged the Tsarist state, the Russian monarchy, and also, crucially, led to the organisation for the first time of the Soviet, which was the Council of Workers and of Workers' Deputies, an elected body where essentially grew out of the needs of organising the strike. People from different workplaces were elected to lead the organisation of the general strike, but it took on, in the context of the revolution, a much bigger meaning. It took on the form and the content of a potentially alternative workers' government, and it was that really was the starting point for Trotsky's innovation, even if that's only part of the theory that he underlined. And Trotsky wasn't simply some kind of academic like myself, an abstract theoretician sitting in a university looking at what was going on. He was actually the second chairman of the Soviet. He was one of the leaders of it, and revolutionary himself, right in the thick of events. So the ideas around permanent revolution came into being to grapple with specific problems that he faced at that time, specific kind of challenges. One of these was the relative weakness, the cowardliness of the Russian middle class, of the bourgeoisie, that rather than leading forward the struggle against the old, essentially some kind of half-medieval structures of the Russian state, fighting for a modern capitalist state with bourgeois democracy, parliaments and government of the kinds that had been established in Western Europe, it was very weak and cowardly, stood in fact behind the political development of the working class, preferred to stand side by side with the Tsarist state, with the government, with the Tsar's government, rather than push the revolution forward to victory. And this contrasted massively with the creativity and courage of the working class, which, as I mentioned before, in the Soviet had taken enormous leaps forward in terms of political organisation. Trotsky, in fact, was almost the only person really to grasp the political significance of the Soviet in this respect. The other problem that the Russian Revolution of 1905 threw up was the idea that the revolutionary process in the East, by which was meant really not the core of the world capitalist system in Western Europe, but countries on the periphery of it, which were less developed economically compared to Britain or Germany, for example, at the core of the system at the time. Actually, in contrast to what almost everybody in the socialist movement internationally at the time thought, Russian workers turned out to be far in advance in terms of their organisation and politics than large sections of the Western working class and their leadership, where, although you had, for example, very large, apparently Marxist-led organisations in Germany, when it came to the test, and this was still in the future when Trotsky was developing these ideas in 1905, when it came to the ultimate test, the beginning of World War I, those huge organisations, huge workers' organisations, turned out not to be in favour of revolution, but actually in favour of both reform and also, crucially, of working within the existing system and giving in to the pressure for supporting the war. As I said, this was in the future in 1905. This was something that would come to take place in 1914, 1915. But what Trotsky started to grapple with was the idea that the Russian working class was showing signs of that actually the revolutionary process could be more developed in the West, in the East, and lead by example to workers in the West. And essentially what this meant then, again, this is a process that would be drawn out across the period of Trotsky's lifetime and later, of what that meant in terms of the tactics and strategy that revolutionary socialists should follow in order to join up and develop a movement that could move forward towards leading a revolution on an international scale. It had been understood by Marxists for generations, since Marx and Engels started to develop their ideas understanding capitalism in the middle of the 19th century, that as capitalism developed into a world system, you couldn't simply have the victory of a revolution in a single country. It would have to develop beyond that. What Trotsky did was really emphasise the importance of the international aspect of the socialist revolution. And as I said before, he started grasping towards and developing these ideas in the context of 1905 within sort of 15 years or so, 12, 15 years later, the explosion of the Second Russian Revolution in 1917 confirmed many of these basic premises. The Russian working class seized power. It detonated a wave of revolutions that went from east to west, not from west to east. But actually the failure then of revolution to spread to the west, and the failure of the working class to come to victory in Germany or in Britain or in any of the other countries in the heart of Europe, ultimately and tragically doomed the revolution in Russia, which then turned inwards towards the establishment of towards a counter-revolution led by Stalin, and the idea, which was fundamentally at odds with what classical Marxist tradition had always argued, that Stalin argued that socialism could be built in one country, and essentially founded a new state capitalist regime. Trotsky argued, in contrast to this, that actually the international dimension of the revolution was critical. So much for the history lesson. You might say, what on earth has that got to do with what's happening in the Middle East at the moment? So what I want to do is then take that and look at some of the basic problems that Trotsky was confronting and ask if they are still relevant to us today in terms of how we try and understand the Arab revolutions. I would say there are three basic areas, and I'm going to try and illustrate these. I'm mainly going to talk about Egypt, which I'm sorry, I'm a bit obsessed with Egypt. I'm going to Cairo in a few days' time, so most of the specific detail will relate to that, but we can talk in the discussion and try and relate it to some of the revolutions that are taking place elsewhere in the region. The first of these, I said there were three, the first of these is actually the question of the problem of the relationship between the democratic and social revolutions, where you're talking about what the aims and demands of people who are fighting in the streets, organising strikes in the workplaces, fighting by various means and methods to advance the revolution. The second question that I think Trotsky was addressing in 1905 and throughout the development of the Permanent Revolution, which still is a very live question, is wrapped up with the question of the problem of leadership of the struggle, and whether there is the objective conditions are met for the working class to become the leader of the revolution, to fight on behalf of and to have a chance of winning the revolution on behalf of the wider layers of the people, the poor, the oppressed, and so on. And that the importance of that question, I think, will come out when I talk in some more detail about the specific issues in Egypt. The reason for focusing on the question of the objective conditions for working class leadership of the struggle is important. One of Trotsky's greatest theoretical advances was the idea of an even combined development, where he brought to light a new way of interpreting how the development of Russian society actually did give a small but concentrated working class the opportunity to come to the leadership of the revolutionary process. That there was an objective barrier that had to be crossed. You couldn't magic a socialist revolution into a country if there was no industrial working class. but you didn't have to have some kind of mechanical or stagist view of a certain threshold of the numbers of workers that were involved and so on. There were a whole number of factors that he drew in to explain how it was that the Russian working class could play this role. The third area, which again is extremely relevant if you look at what's happening in the revolutions in the Arab world today, is the question of the relationship between the struggle on the national stage and the international stage, which, if you read some of Trotsky's later writings, his theses around permanent revolution, tended to be focused on the specific problems that were which were facing the Bolshevik leadership, of which he was part, the leadership of the victorious Russian Revolution of 1917, when it found that the wave of revolutions was slowing and grinding to a halt, and it was becoming isolated. So they're very much concerned with the problem of trying to confront this idea that socialism could be built within the confines of one country, and so on. But I think the question of the international and the national, of the relationship between the national and the international, goes very much to the heart of everything that Trotsky is saying, both in terms of how it shapes the objective development of the social relations and the objective development of the working class within particular societies, through the intervention of international capital within borders of specific nation states, and that therefore is a question that comes right through the whole idea of permanent revolution. The final point, those are the main three areas that I want to look at now, but I think the final point, which again is not really, has to be the starting point, must have been the starting point for Trotsky's understanding and concept of permanent revolution, i.e. the Soviet, the active intervention of workers in making their own history, has got to be the ending point for where we finish this discussion, and the difference that the struggle by proletarian methods, as he put in some of his other writings on 1905, that the methods by which people struggle to take forward a revolution can have an absolutely enormous and crucial difference to the outcome, provided that the other conditions are met. So, to come on to the question of the democratic and the social, I just want to say firstly that by this talking about democratic and social revolutions, I don't mean democratic as simply a shorthand for a bourgeois revolution. There is an entire other meeting, and probably series of meetings could be had on this question about the nature of bourgeois revolutions and so on. Neil Davidson has just written a very enormous book on bourgeois revolutions. There's been a large amount of debate about this, and I encourage people to read up on this. All for this session that I wanted to say about this question is that when I'm talking about the struggle for a democratic revolution in the context of Egypt, I don't mean that Egypt was not a capitalist society before the revolution, or there's some any kind of feudal hangover in the way that the Egyptian society is structured. It was a capitalist society, is a capitalist society still. The revolution could, I think, in the right circumstances, point the way towards a socialist revolution. If certain conditions are met and if certain things continue to develop, that's a possibility, but you're definitely not talking about the kind of revolutions that took place at an earlier stage, at the beginning of the development of capitalism. Again, there's a debate about, therefore, whether you can talk about permanent revolution still in this context, and I would tend to agree with the arguments that Joseph Chunara has made about this. He wrote an article a year or so ago about this, where he argued that this question about the different kinds of struggles for democracy within capitalism are still relevant to the theory as a whole, by which therefore I mean actually the specific kinds of struggles that we see going on in Egypt at the moment. Why are people in the streets of Cairo over the last few days? They're actually fighting over quite specific democratic demands about the composition of the Constituent Assembly, whether it should be just filled with people from a certain political trend or not, what kind of powers it should have, whether the executive and the judiciary, which the separation of powers, all sorts of things which you tend to learn about in political science or and so on, but rarely in the modern world often appear to be a case of life and death struggles on the streets. Actually, those are some of the questions which have mobilised millions of people in Egypt over the last over the last couple of years. The question of meaningful elections, of whether elections should mean something or should be simply fixed by the ruling party. That is something that has been a demand raised by people during the Egyptian revolution. The struggle for a more, if you like, a kind of more complete form of bourgeois democracy in Egypt is something that also has quite long roots, going back to 2004, when some of the first protests took place. The alliance that was going to be called, or the movement that was going to be called Kafaya Enough, started to take shape almost exactly 8 years ago, which brought together some people from Islamist groups, which are the largest opposition groups, like the Muslim Brotherhood, although the Muslim Brotherhood itself wasn't particularly involved with this. Some people who were liberals, some people who were on the revolutionary left, and a layer of people started to challenge the and agitate for greater democratic rights. But I said this question is a question about the problem, the relationship between the democratic and the social struggles, because actually those democratic struggles would never have reached a threshold of mass action, of mobilised millions of people, without the intervention of the workers' movement, without the intervention of workers' struggles, which around 2 years later exploded into a huge wave of strikes, which carries on certainly in a sense to this day. That workers' strikes were not generally raising similar democratic demands openly. They were about things like better pay, better conditions, against the intervention of the state security in the specific factory where people worked, sometimes about the right to organise a trade union separately without government intervention, and so on. But they almost never, in fact I can think of no example of mass strikes where people raised directly the kind of democratic demands about the role of the president, the ruling party, and so on. Without that social struggle going on at the same time and within the same context, the democratic demands, which were relatively constrained to a fairly small number of activists and intellectuals and so on, would never have reached a mass audience, and vice versa. That I think that also the rise of the democratic movement and the protests in the streets, and also over other questions in terms of the movement in solidarity with the Palestinians, the anti-war movement from 2003, which even obviously predated the rise of Kafaya and the democratic demands of that particular phase of the struggle. Without those, again, I think it's hard to see how the workers' movement would itself have generalised and developed into a mass movement. In other words, there was a process of reciprocal action, as Rosa Luxemburg talked about in her classic book, The Mass Strike, which actually incidentally was also written in response to the 1905 revolution. A process of reciprocal action can be seen at work between the social and democratic struggles. And you can see this developing over the course of the revolution itself, with the overthrow of Mubarak, where you have the waves of struggles over quite specific democratic demands. Firstly, against the military, continuing to wield power. Then, more recently, against the Muslim Brotherhood-led government, which has came into power after the elections last year. I mean, in a sense, you can kind of see people working through this process of successive approximations, of looking for one solution after another to try and get closer to achieving the goals of the revolution, and that without the continuing waves of social struggle, particularly the mass waves of strikes, which actually destabilise and rock the state apparatus and make it extremely difficult for any of the reformists, whether they are Islamist reformists or whether they're secular reformists, to get a really deep implantation into the state. That without seeing that connection, it's very hard to understand why it is millions of people, or hundreds of thousands of people at least, will come into the streets and fight for seemingly fairly dry demands about the Constituent Assembly, so on and so forth. I don't think you can understand the latest round of protests at all without seeing the echo of the 1,000 or so strikes that took place in the first couple of months of Mohamed Morsi's being president. But equally, there's a problem, because the connection between the political, the democratic and the social demands doesn't lead to the kind of fusion that Trotsky saw in 1905. the old state still remains intact. The question of breakdown of that authoritarian state is very real. But as yet, you haven't seen the development of forms of working class organisation that can actually raise the kind of slogans that that make that that can lead that struggle to a new level and start a process of the growing over, if you like, from democratic to social revolution. And this brings on to the second question, which I'm going to have to hurry up because I'm being sent a note. The question, the problem of leadership, that it does make a very great difference, the methods of struggle that people use when they're fighting for the democratic demands. The integration of the social and political demands is actually a very important aspect of the struggle. One of the slogans, I think, of 1905 the Bolsheviks raised was 8 hours and a gun, by which they wanted to have a maximum 8 hour day and a gun in order to fight to defend the revolution. You could say, actually, in the Egyptian context today, perhaps a useful one would be a new constituent assembly and a Butagaz bottle, because one of the things that that Mohamed Morsi's government has been doing has been massively attacking the subsidies of subsidised supplies of cooking gas and bread, on which millions of Egyptians depend. The problem is that actually the social demands are not generally being very strongly raised in the protests that are happening at the moment, which allows actually for some mushiness to creep in. So it allows people like Amr Moussa, who is was a key figure in the old regime. He wasn't in the first rank of the people who were closest to Mubarak at the last stage, but he was a senior figure in the ruling party and former foreign minister, and then head of the Arab League. He was by no means an oppositionist, let alone any kind of revolutionary. But he has been projected into the leadership, partly of the protests. The integration of the social and political demands is absolutely crucial in order to unleash that transformative power of workers fighting for democratic demands by their own methods. Trotsky's contribution really around this question, I think, in relation to Russia, was to show that working class leadership in the revolutionary process was not an accident, but was a logical potential outcome of Russian economic and social development. That it wasn't something that you could simply count up the number of workers, as a whole within Russian society. You actually had to look at how concentrated they were. You had to look at what kinds of industry they worked in. Were they well connected or disconnected from international capital? Actually, the heart of the Russian Revolution was in factories like the Putilov works, which was a huge armaments factory in Petrograd, which was one of the leading places in the leading workplaces in the revolution, and that contrasted the explosive contradiction between the huge concentration of workers there and vast swathes of Russian society, which were still peasant farmers and so on, who'd barely emerged from feudalism a few generations before, was something that helped to detonate the revolutionary process. I haven't got time to here, because I have to sum up. I haven't got time to go into some of the aspects of combined and uneven development in Egypt at the moment, but I think you can make a very good case for seeing how different layers, and the way in which the Egyptian working class is formed, shows that it does have the potential to use the fact that the things like the combination of having huge workplaces still, like Mahala, the big textile mill in Mahala, 20,000 workers in one workplace, hugely important traditions of struggle, even though also within the textile industry you have lots of small workshops and so on and so forth. It's or the role of the Suez Canal workers, again, about 20,000 or so workers who play an absolutely pivotal role, individually contribute millions of dollars to the Egyptian economy every year by the work that they do, play an absolutely critical role in the Egyptian economy. That they have an absolutely immense potential power if it's used. In order to have some time for questions and discussion, I'm going to leave most of the issues around the national and the international. But I'm hoping people will ask about that, and then we can talk about it in the discussion. So I'll apologise to the chair if I've gone on beyond my time.
All right, yeah.